Medical coding requires translating the variable, chaotic reality of clinical practice into strict, mathematically valid alphanumeric data. The central tension in this profession is that a physician's documentation and the ICD-10-CM classification system frequently do not align perfectly. Forcing a complex diagnosis into the wrong structural space triggers immediate system warnings, invalid codes, and rejected claims. To master ICD-10-CM, you must understand the architecture of specificity. You have to learn how to diagnose exactly where the information gap exists between the patient's chart and the code set. Looking at this blueprint layout of a 7-slot sequence, the first 2 structural failure points occur when there is an information gap. You must identify if that gap is a documentation error, NOS, or a system limitation, NEC. The final failure point is at the end. You must map data precisely into this isolated, mandatory 7th position. Understanding this alphanumeric syntax is the only way to capture the true clinical picture, while guaranteeing the resulting claim is valid and payable. Every time you encounter an information gap in ICD-10-CM, you must classify it through one of 2 logic gates, NEC or NOS. This split-screen model illustrates the divide between the provider's chart on the left and the code database on the right. NOS, or not otherwise specified, occurs when the source data on the left is vague or incomplete. For example, the physician writes upper respiratory infection and stops there. No further details are provided in the chart. The system asks for more specifics, but the data simply isn't there. This makes NOS a pure documentation limitation. The classification system has specific codes available, but the provider did not supply the details needed to use them. NEC, or not elsewhere classifiable, is the exact opposite. This occurs when the provider's documentation is highly specific and robust. Suppose the chart states the patient has a bubblegum respiratory infection. You have exactly what the clinical situation is. But when you cross over to the ICD-10-CM database, there is nowhere to place it. Despite possessing a wealth of clinical detail, the coding system lacks a unique, exact code for this specific condition. Therefore, NEC is a system limitation. The chart is complete, but the classification system falls short. The AMCI MJ gem for this is straightforward. NEC means we know, but no code. The second half of that axiom is that NOS means we don't know. Correctly identifying whether the limitation stems from the documentation or the system dictates your entire coding path. It prevents you from misclassifying the severity and nature of the patient's condition. Once you diagnose the nature of the information gap in the alphabetic index, you have to validate that decision in the tabular list.
Here, the abstract concepts of NEC and NOS physically manifest as strict numerical patterns at the end of a code sequence. Codes categorizing an NEC other specified condition logically correlate to code terminations of 0.8 or 0.9. Conversely, codes representing an NOS unspecified condition typically sort into terminations of 0.9 or 0.0. Notice the overlap at 0.9. Both concepts can terminate here, requiring you to pay close attention to the tabular notes to confirm what that specific digit represents. This structural overlap often leads to the error of defaulting to unspecified NOS codes out of convenience, even when the physician provided detailed, specific documentation. Relying on NOS when an NEC option is supported strips the clinical specificity from the record and creates severe compliance risks. Recognizing these tabular numerical patterns ensures you capture the maximum clinical detail available, which directly protects accurate reimbursement rates for the encounter. Beyond the decimal suffixes, the ICD-10-CM architecture enforces a final positional mandate, the 7th character. This horizontal sequence illustrates that certain categories within the system, specifically injuries, fractures, and obstetrics, mandate the completion of a strict 7-character data field. This character is not an optional modifier. It contains critical clinical data that dictates the encounter type, the healing status, or episode of care. The ironclad architectural rule here is 7th means 7th. The final character must sit exactly in the 7th spot. This creates a structural problem. Many base codes in these categories only contain 4 or 5 characters, leaving physical gaps in the sequence before you reach that mandatory position. The mechanical solution to this structural gap is the X placeholder. When the base code is short, the coder must synthetically pad the alphanumeric sequence,
inserting X's to bridge the empty data fields. Padding the sequence physically forces the required encounter data into that final valid 7th position. If you fail to architect the 7th character correctly, even if the diagnosis itself is perfectly mapped, the claim will face an immediate automated denial based purely on structural invalidity. When we look at this multi-stage workflow, it always begins with clinical record analysis. Here, our raw data moves through the logic gate, confirming an NEC system limitation. Identifying that NEC limitation immediately narrows our search criteria in the tabular list. We move to tabular confirmation, matching our specific clinical details to a 0.8 other specified code sequence. Next comes the final check, reviewing the tabular instructions for any specific 7th character requirements. If required, we execute the padding rule, inserting placeholders to achieve a perfectly valid data field architecture. Precision in differentiating between system limitations and documentation gaps safeguards both your reimbursement and your compliance standing, and strict adherence to positional padding prevents the frustration of automated structural denials. Medical coding at this level requires numeric architecture.